On this episode, I talk with special guest Dan Small of Outdoor Wisconsin as we discuss how learning deer's eating habits can help create a more successful hunt on public land. Stay tuned.
Hunt, 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 hunt.
Hello and welcome to the Where to Hunt podcast, the podcast that connects public land hunting enthusiasts. Today is September 29th. I'm your host, Eric Clark. Welcome back to another awesome episode of the Where to Hunt podcast. Got a little bit to get into today. We're going to bring on our guest pretty soon. I'm just going to go ahead and front-end load some of this stuff here. If you want to get in touch with me, Eric, Where to Hunt, the podcast, the Facebook page, the app, anything that you might have questions about, if you want to provide some insight, suggestions, things of that nature, you can go ahead and email us at wheretohunt@gmail.com. That's the word where, the number 2, and the word hunt, WI, @gmail.com. You can check us out on our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/where2huntwisconsin, all spelled out, and Twitter @W2Hunt, or our website, which is publiclandpride.com. That all said, I'm going to go ahead and bring on our guest. All right, we're going to go ahead and welcome our guest of the week to the show. This week we have Dan Small with Outdoor Wisconsin. How you doing, Dan?
Pretty good, Eric. How are you?
Doing well, thank you. And thanks so much for taking time to be a guest this week.
Oh, no problem. I'm always happy to talk about deer.
Awesome. Yeah, me too. Well, there's a lot of people that obviously do know about you, but for those that may not, you want to tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure. For the past 31 years, I've been hosting Outdoor Wisconsin, which is a weekly outdoor magazine, half-hour outdoor show on public television stations throughout the state. In the Milwaukee area, we air on Milwaukee Public TV at 9 o'clock on Thursday nights, and in Madison and around the state, we air, I believe it's Friday evening, but you should always check your listings on the digital channel, so that's 21.2, 38.2, and so on. And I've been doing that for 3 decades, and then for the last 20-some years, I've been doing an hour-long deer hunting special. In fact, we've just wrapped up recording interviews and stuff for that show, and that's going to air in early November. It's going to air on public TV at both the Milwaukee and the state digital network on 9 o'clock Thursday, November 5th, and there are some other times on Fox Sports North and Fox Sports Wisconsin. And then in addition to that, I've got a radio show like you do, and that's on 13 stations around the state at various times. And the best way to figure out when and where you can listen to the show on broadcast is to go to LakeLink, and that's lake-link.com, and just type in the keyword radio, and you'll find 2 shows come up, and mine is one of them, and it'll give you a link to the podcast or the stream. You can listen to the show right there, or there's also a link that tells you when and where we're on broadcast stations. So that's pretty much what I do, in addition to writing for Wisconsin Outdoor News and Wisconsin Sportsman Magazine. And those 4 things keep me pretty busy.
Yeah, I would have to say so. It's a lot to rattle off and even recall, let alone doing all the work involved with each of those facets.
Yeah.
But coming along with that, then, real quick, how long have you been hunting?
Well, I've been hunting since it was legal for me. I grew up in upstate New York, and back when I was a kid, you had to be 14. So I've been hunting since I was 14 in New York. And then, of course, here in Wisconsin, I've lived here for more than 40 years. So I've been hunting deer, grouse, turkeys, pheasants, rabbits, squirrels here in Wisconsin since the early 70s.
Wow. So you started in upstate New York. That's pretty cool. It's I was actually in New York this last June. It was it was absolutely beautiful. Probably a lot prettier this time of year, but
yeah, it is. And people, when you say New York, they think New York City. Well,
yep.
I'm from Western New York, and Western New York is in Wisconsin. Trout streams and lots of turkeys. So I go back to New York every spring to hunt turkeys.
That's exciting. Okay, so this is one question I ask every guest, but do you hunt public land or private land or both?
Primarily private land, or private land. I'm sorry. I used to hunt a fair amount of public land for pheasants primarily, and for grouse up in the north. But since I moved south, and I live now in the southwest, not far from La Crosse, I don't get up north so much anymore to hunt grouse. Here there isn't a lot of public land in the southwest, so I got to know a lot of individual landowners, and had permission to hunt on a variety of different private lands. For turkeys, it's harder to get permission to hunt deer on private land. So I hunt on my own land down here, or on a little bit of land I own up north in Bayfield County.
Good to go. Well, that's a cool tactic, asking individual landowners in the southern part of the county or state. The topic of this week's show is trying to cover some of the deer biology, especially as it relates to what deer feed on and when they feed on those types of foods. How extensive is your knowledge with the basic deer food groups as it pertains, trying to line it up with public land access and hunting, because there's a lot of guys on private land that do food plots and things like that. So there's a huge topic there, but it can be really beneficial to understand what a deer is eating when, and insofar as what times of the year, to try to get on more deer. What has been your experience with that, if you don't mind, because I'm sure you've run into a lot of different people in the industry, considering your longstanding career in what you've been doing based on what you described earlier.
Well, deer eat pretty much the same thing on public land that they eat on private land, with the exception of agricultural products. On private land, it's soybeans and alfalfa in the summer, and then corn whenever they can get into it, whenever it's got enough on the ears for them to eat. But outside of agricultural crops, and they don't eat 100% ag crops, as some people think they do, they're browsers, and that is, they're eating buds and leaves and twigs off of a variety of shrubs and trees. They also eat grasses and what are called forbs, and that is succulent green, low-growing vegetation like cinquefoil, if you know what that is, and strawberry. Those are some of the things they eat. But I've actually witnessed a deer, not too long ago. I was turkey hunting and watching a doe come along the hillside, and this was in early spring, and the leaves on little dogwood and little plum trees were just coming out. So they were, the bushes were not fully leafed out. There were just a few leaves here and a few leaves there. And this doe was walking along, and she would nibble a little clump of leaves here, and then she'd take a step, and she'd take a leaf or two off the next bush, and a leaf or two off the next bush. And so she was literally, and that's, the term browsing is, we talk about people browsing in a library. You kind of walk along and you look at this book and you look at that book. Well, that's kind of the way deer eat, is they don't just chow down in one spot like they do in a bait pile. If you put out bait, that's what they do. But in nature, they walk along and they take a little bite here and a little bite there, and you might not see the impact of their feeding except in the wintertime when the food is scarce and they eat things like white cedar, and then they create a browse line where you see the lower branches of cedar trees just totally browsed off up to the point where deer can reach by standing up on their hind legs. I know that's a rambling answer, but
that's what we're looking for here, to be honest.
Yeah.
You said a couple of things. When I was looking into this topic, clearly deer eat what they're going to eat, regardless of, they don't know if they're on public or private land.
Right.
But it's just interesting to think about if you're on a larger patch of public land and there's not, crops around, if you're trying to put yourself in a good spot and you're trying to do that based on what the deer might be eating, where their food sources are, things of that nature, it's just better to understand, things like browse and forbs. You try to Google forbs, and it takes some word crafting on a search engine to get to the point where it talks about, oh, this is what deer eat. because
Yeah.
it's such a strange word. There's not a lot of resources out there that talk about it. By and large, you gotta kind of dig. So it's nice to have a conversational tone behind it to just understand. Okay, that's what that stuff is.
Yeah. Well, you don't really have to identify the plants, and I can't identify a lot of them myself. You just have to know the kinds of places where these things grow, and that's where you find the deer. So, for instance, gas line and power line rights of way, which cross both public and private land, and they are often mowed, and sometimes they're sprayed, but those that are mowed are actually better, because then you've got everything's growing up fresh right after it's mowed, which is usually once a year or sometimes once every couple of years. So rights of way, that's one place where you find a lot of greens. Woods edges, deer and other a lot of other wildlife happen to be creatures of the edge. Now we think of deer as woodland creatures, deep in the forest, but there's a lot more variety of food, and in some cases cover types along the edge of the woods. So you'll find dogwood shrubs, you'll find hazel growing, and then you'll find out in the field itself, if the woods is tall, the tall trees are, and then as you go out a few yards into the woods, you've got apple trees or thorn apple trees, and you got dogwoods, and it's almost like tapering down, like angling down to the grass level. There's a tremendous variety of things for deer to eat in that situation. Another place you find succulent greens for deer to eat is logging trails, or in national and state and county forests up north, where there are hunter walking trails. In some instances, these are mowed and actually seeded to clover, and it's like a salad bar for deer and grouse and other animals as well. Now, a lot of grouse hunters walk along those trails, but early and late in the day, you can hunt along them for deer. You can set up a stand between a hunter walking trail or a logging road and, say, a bedding area, so that you can intercept the deer coming or going. That's always a good strategy. I like also to look for, and I find these up north and sometimes in central Wisconsin on public land, and I've stumbled on a lot of these areas. One, grouse hunting. Yes, that's when I spent more time on public land, was when I was grouse hunting. But I like to hunt abandoned orchards. So if you find an old farmstead or an old foundation sometimes, or an old silo or a silo foundation, look around. You'll find apple trees. And where you find apple trees, you'll find deer. Apples that hit the ground don't last very long up north. The bears, the deer, the rabbits, and grouse eat them up pretty quickly. So an orchard is always worth checking out.
Absolutely.
So those are some of the things that deer eat earlier in the season, and then of course now the acorns are dropping.
That was I was happy you said that. I was definitely something I was going to ask you, because I hear so much chatter about acorns. So go on. Thank you.
Yeah. When the acorns are dropping, and they eat both the red oak and white oak acorns, but people tell me they prefer the red oak. So if you can tell the difference, white oak leaves are lobed, round lobe, and red oak or black oak or pin oak, and those are all varieties of different species of red oak. Those leaves have lobes that are sharp pointed. So if you see pointed oak leaves, those are of the red oak family, and deer seem to like those acorns better, from what I've been told. You look for oaks, look for acorns, look for evidence of deer or turkeys having scratched the ground up to pick up acorns. Beechnut is another mast crop that deer like. Beechnuts are not as regular as acorns. They don't form every year, but when they do, it's usually a bumper crop. And the beech tree is not very common away from the Great Lakes. They tend to be within a few miles of Lake Michigan. and you don't have them really in central Wisconsin or northern Wisconsin in any great abundance. But where I used to live over in Ozaukee County, man, we had beech woods there behind the house, and deer and turkeys were in there every year that there was a good crop. And you got to learn to identify the difference or tell the difference between deer scratchings and turkey scratchings. Deer tend to mill around and scratch up a much larger area, whereas turkeys will walk a few yards and they'll scratch maybe a square foot or 2 square feet, and they'll peck around and they'll pick up the acorns or the beech nuts or the worms or whatever they find, and then they'll walk along and they'll do it again. And their scratchings all generally point in the direction that the birds are moving. That is, they walk forward and they scratch backwards. So if you see a small area that looks like kind of like a scrape, and all the leaves are kind of pushed in one direction, that means the turkeys were going the opposite way. They're going the way toward the open end of the scratching. Deer just kind of mill around, and so if you see a lot of leaves moved around and areas that are kind of torn up, that's probably where deer are feeding. So there's no point in hunting deer where the turkeys are feeding. I mean, they will feed in the same areas, but make sure you're sitting on deer feeding activity and not turkey activity.
Makes a lot of sense. No, that's pretty. Par for the course. Every time I go deer hunting, I see turkeys everywhere. It's ridiculous. Of course, that's the animal I see when I'm trying to get something else, some other tag filled. But I had an instance when I was bow hunting last year. I think it was last year, and I had a couple doe coming down a deer trail, and then some turkeys coming perpendicular, and neither one of them had seen each other or noticed each other. By the time they figured out, they both freaked out and went the opposite directions. I was like, that was stupid to just watch. Dang it. It's like the blind leading the blind out there. Is a really silly scenario.
Yeah.
But
I think they startle each other occasionally like that. I actually missed a turkey one time because it was walking along a trail, and I saw 2 deer past the turkey. The turkey was between me and the deer, and I was concerned that the deer might spook the turkey, and I shot too soon, and the turkey got away.
It's kind of cool to be out there and see that kind of stuff happening. You always wonder how they interact with each other. People get that stuff caught on their trail cams, but it's cool to see it yourself.
Yep.
No, you've covered the topic well. I don't know. There's probably tons more that you could speak to, but that's the gist of it. I just wanted to kind of give people some direction and thought on what to look for and how to, not like you said, not the specific plant type per se, but just general areas. And even the thing with the turkeys and knowing like all those leaves are pointed in the same direction. That's a turkey. That's not a deer. I'm not going to waste my time in this spot. It's super insightful kind of things that someone hears this podcast, when they listen to it, they carry that with them. It's just going to make someone a little bit better, a little sharper out there that they wouldn't have considered before if they didn't already know that. But
let me throw in one bit of advice here.
Yeah, thank you.
Whatever food source you're hunting, it's generally better to set up a stand between that food source and a bedding area rather than park right on the food source. Now, in an oak woods, you can sometimes get away with putting up a stand right in the woodlot in the food source. But if you find a trail or that there's some heavy brush not too far away, and you see evidence of deer having traveled either along that trail or just through the woods, because you see droppings or you can see where the leaves are turned over and they've been walking. If you can find a place along that travel corridor that's downwind and set up a stand, or just hide if you're hunting on the ground, just sit with your back against a tree or sit on a stump or something, you have a better chance of intercepting a deer going from the food to bedding areas and back, and a better chance of a shot at a deer than you do if you park on either bedding or feeding areas, because it's hard to sneak into those areas without busting a deer that might be in there, because sometimes they'll bed in the middle of the day and sometimes they'll feed in the middle of the day. They typically feed early, late, or all night, as people know, and then travel back to bed in the morning. And it's often hard. It took me a long time to figure out, well, now I know where they feed, how the heck am I going to get there before daylight without spooking them? Well, you figure out where they're going after the sun comes up and wait for them there. So you don't have to be sitting on the food source. You just sit, 200 yards from the food source because you know they're going to come back this way. So
no, that's awesome.
Doesn't work all the time, but it's it's something to keep in mind.
Well, we get fixated and we get our blinders on when we think we're onto something. You're like, oh, there's tracks or sign. They are obviously feeding here. I'm going to put up right here, and then you kind of are not looking at the big picture, like you said. Back up 200 yards, and you're going to have a better shot at it if you're intercepting from their bedding area because they'll go back. As long as you haven't busted it already. But and you make another good point earlier on too, where you're talking about some of these trails, the power line trails or whatever that's cut, and or even the hunting trails. It's so funny, on public land, people will ridicule other hunters for being lazy sometimes, but in fact, there's a lot of the sign you'll see and a lot of the deer you'll see will be right off the trail, or you come back to your truck and you have all these tracks right there, and you're like, what the heck? I trudge all the way in the woods, 5 miles or whatever it might be, and didn't see anything, and you get back and you see all the sign that wasn't there on the way in, if it's snowy or whatever. That might not be the best example if it's snowy, but again, it's just another thing to consider, how you can strategize your plan of attack.
Mm-hmm. And one other thing, now that we're talking, if you've got public land that borders croplands, and there are a lot of places
absolutely
in the state where you've got acres and acres of corn, and then there's a row, there's a fence line, and then it's woods, and that happens to be public hunting land, whether it's state or county forest or just private land that was, that's leased and open to public hunting. Well, instead of parking yourself right on the edge where the deer are going to go out into the field, if you can backtrack, again, find a trail that's a couple hundred yards, maybe not even that far, maybe just 75 yards back into the woods, you have a better chance of getting a shot, especially at a buck. Because early in the year, now, once the rut is on and once the gun season is on, all bets are off because deer do crazy things. But before they're being disturbed, I've watched soybean fields in late summer, and the first thing that comes out is a doe and a fawn or two, and then maybe a half hour later, a small buck or two, and then eventually, just before dark, the buck that most people want to shoot. And that buck, he didn't just make a beeline from his bedding area out to the field at dark. He worked his way from bedding, wherever he was bedding, to the field edge, and he maybe he hung around for 15, 20 minutes, half an hour or more, watching the deer activity in the field to see whether anything was bothering them. He didn't get to be a 3 or 4 year old deer by just sauntering out in the field when he was hungry.
I've heard that before. That's so crazy to think that they are really that intelligent. So if the other deer that are out there, the small buck, the doe, the fawns, if they're keeping an eye on one particular corner, or they're acting really edgy, that buck's gonna hang back, like you'd said. That's that just blows my mind that's what we're up against sometimes. So you got to really think it through, like you said.
Yeah. Well, I don't give them a lot of mental intelligence or human intelligence, but they're wary, and they have learned that if I stay here until dark, I get to come back tomorrow.
Yeah.
And they. I won't say they're not stupid, but they certainly are. They're very alert. They're very wary, and they pay attention to other deer. So if a doe and a fawn are out there in the field and they're feeding and their tails are just flicking back and forth, and everything's hunky dory, that buck will come out. But if the doe is stomping her feet, snorting, if her tail goes up, you're not going to see him that night.
Right.
Not very likely, anyway. But if he's hanging back, and your stand is 50, 75 yards from the woods, chances are you'll get a shot at him while there's still shooting light, legal light, before he commits to going out in that field. I mean, you don't care whether you take him on the edge or back in the woods.
No, absolutely not. You have to drag him either way, yeah.
Yeah, you won't get a shot sometimes if you're right out on the edge. I've seen all along the edge of the field. Well, that's nice, but the deer the deer like canopy cover. They're going to be back in the woods most of the time.
No, all very good information. Dan, I thank you so much for taking time to chat with me today on the show.
Yeah, you bet. Glad to do it.
Looking for a spot to hunt? Download the free Where to Hunt app for your smartphone today. Avoid hunters, see less people, see more deer. With the Where to Hunt app, you will know where other hunters are before you see them. Just search Where to Hunt from the App Store to download today.
Hope you guys enjoyed the interview with Dan Small. Smart guy. He's been doing this stuff for a long time, so he really knows what he's talking about. I personally got a lot out of that. Hopefully you guys did too. For our tip of the week, it's not a DIY. We'll come back to that next week. But I host another podcast too. It's actually called the Wildernet Podcast, and I talk a lot in there about how much I have this hatred for mosquitoes. I just, man, I don't know, I can't stand them. It ruins a good time. It kills the mood. They're frustrating. They're aggravating. Nothing is good about them. They can kill you. They give you West Nile virus, whatever. So as an early season bow hunter, that's something you have to battle with a little bit, depending on where you're going to go. And in fact, my first bow hunt out this season, I was in a cattail marsh. And before the season started, I'd read a couple reviews and I heard from a couple other hunters, friends, things of that nature that, I should really try out the Thermacell because I hate bugs so much, or mosquitoes. So I did. I tried it out, and lo and behold, the thing worked magnificently. Hands down, without a doubt, the best frickin' 20 some odd bucks I've spent, especially in relation to hunting. I hate mosquitoes, and I've had a difficult time dealing with them in early bow season before. So even in a full-on marsh right by a creek, but I could see the mosquitoes. I could see them everywhere. And initially, it takes this thing a little bit to kick in, but once it does, not a chance. No mosquitoes bother you at all, and they didn't bother me at all. I went out a second time this past weekend, and again was at a river bottom, very swampy, and I was on a higher ground eventually, but as a result, there was like some nasty little pond nearby too. I was trying to hunt that in some aspect, thinking the deer might get thirsty and going for water. Again, a crap ton of mosquitoes. Nonetheless, playing the wind as best I could. The deer came from a different direction than I had expected, and I practice scent control as best as any hunter can try to, but I had the Thermacell with me again, and 6 doe came through, and not an issue at all. I don't know at what point it would be a concern in terms of scent, but I had read on some other forums and things of that nature, people talking about this Thermacell, that you can actually get the dirt scented one or something like that, or to filter it out. I don't know. I didn't see that when I bought mine, but again, a $20 some odd purchase, great investment for early season bow hunting when you're battling mosquitoes. It will save your hunt if you are as against mosquitoes and have a hatred and you loathe them. If you're anything like me in that regard, I recommend that. That's my tip for the week. I won't go on and on and on about it, but that's what I have to say about that.
I am a hunter and I am safe. I got my long johns on and my orange ablaze. I have my GPS and I never lose my place. I am a hunter and I am safe.
Welcome to the final section or segment of the show. Still am not sure what to call this segment. We'll figure it out one of these days. This week's episode, I have a weird one from Texas. Let's make fun of Texas. It's our big state. There's a lot of people, so you're bound to find some stupid down there, or anywhere for that matter. And that might sound derogatory, but it is what it is. You don't have to listen. But really, it's a way to have a call out to be safe. Learn from other mistakes or others' mistakes. And this one, this is from 2013 actually, so I'm digging a little deeper here. But there's a conception that there's a group of hunters in general, a lot of in Wisconsin too, where people say if it's brown, it's down, and that's cool, right? You got to feed your family, you got to put meat in the freezer, stuff like that. and on public land it can be scarce. But in this case, if it's brown, it's down, cause some harm. Here's the synopsis. Shooter shot at brown object 100 yards away thinking it was a deer. Shooter was unaware of any other hunters on the property. The victim was dressed in brown and camouflage backpack. The bullet struck the victim in the chest, narrowly missing their heart. It's pretty messed up, actually. 100-yard shot, you think you can distinguish through your scope what's a deer and what's not. And again, being certain of your target and beyond. I don't know, if you're gun hunting deer with a rifle, if you can make a shot at 100 yards, you better be damn sure what you're shooting at, and likely that other person should really be wearing blaze orange. Maybe the case that they were wearing blaze orange, it doesn't say, and they had this, what it does say is they had this camouflage backpack. So it's pretty freaking sketchy. There's a lot of those things for sale in the big box, outfitter stores, Cabela's, Gander Mountain, Bass Pro Shops, Legendary Whitetails. You can get that kind of gear, and it's really nice to have that because there's so many pockets and such. But make me think twice about wearing one of those in the woods. I have a little fanny pack, call it what you will, but it's useful and it doesn't make me look brown or like a deer, so decreases my odds for getting shot at, apparently. Please be safe out there, everybody. These stories are silly. If it's brown and it's down, if it's a deer, be sure, all right? Thanks for listening. Hunt public, and we appreciate any feedback you can provide about the show. Keep it coming, and we'll keep recording good episodes for you. Thanks so much.
In the right direction, I'm a hunter, and I am safe.